And welcome everyone to our presentation on how to avoid the next pandemic with Dr. Aysha Akhtar. This is being recorded, so this should be on YouTube. This is a production of from the Dearborn Heights Libraries, which is in Dearborn Heights, Michigan. Um, so Dr. Aysha Akhtar, MD, MPH, is a double board certified neurologist and preventative medicine specialist with a background in public health. She is the CEO of the Center for Contemporary Sciences, which is pioneering the transition to replace the use of animals in experimentation with effective human-based technologies. Dr. Akhtar is the author of the recent book, Our Symphony with Animals, on Health, Empathy, and Our Shared Destinies, combining medicine, social science, and stories. Her book explores how deeply the well-being of humans and animals are entwined. She is also the author of Animals in Public Health, which argues for the need of medical health institutions to include animals as part of the public in public health. Dr. Akhtar is a fellow of the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics. Previously, she served as Deputy Director of the U.S. Army Traumatic Brain Injury Program and Commander in the U.S. Public Health Service Commissioned Corps. Dr. Akhtar has appeared in television shows and interviewed by national media. Now, this is going to be an interview, and since there's so few of us, just feel free to, or you could put it in chat or raise your hand, but feel free to just raise your question. In fact, I'm not even going to mute anybody. I don't think there'd be any problems with static. Now, Dr. Akhtar is insightful that in 2014, she did a TED Talk, and in that talk, she prophesied, let me quote here, it is just a matter of time before a new virus emerges that has the right combination to be both deadly and contagious. I know this was meant for factory farms, but I guess it's not much from the wet markets.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So actually, when I gave that talk, I was talking about a lot of different ways that we can get infectious diseases, and factory farming was one. But I was also talking about the wildlife trade and the wet markets or what's probably a better term is live markets. Live animal markets is one part of the overall wildlife trade. But we have seen, of course, with COVID-19 that it likely came out from the main source was likely one of these live markets in China. And in these markets, these are where a lot of animals are being sold for use as food. They're being sold for medicinal objects. There's a lot of traditional medicine use of animal parts. They're being sold for a variety of reasons. The markets are quite cruel, actually. They're incredibly cruel in the way that they treat animals. Animals are kept in cages. Sometimes they're stacked by the tens or 20s into a cage where the animals at the bottom of the cage may be crushed to death or suffocate to death by the other animals on top. And these are animals who are undergoing a lot of stress and distress. And what really makes these markets so bad is that you're bringing together a lot of different species into one place, and these are a lot of stressed animals brought into one space. And these are, when we have stress, when we're distressed, our immune system can go down. It affects our immune system. It affects our ability to fight off new infections, and that also happens with other animals. So you have many different species brought together into one space, many animals very distressed, suffering a great deal, and their immune systems are down. So it makes it very easy for an infectious disease to pass on from one species onto another, and then ultimately onto humans, which is what we suspected happened here at this market. We suspect that the primary source of this coronavirus is a type of fruit bat. And fruit bats can carry a lot of different viruses, but they're usually just carriers. They're called natural hosts if they don't get sick from the virus. And normally, traditionally, we didn't get a lot of these infectious diseases from fruit bats because we didn't add them to the wild. We didn't exploit them and use them in the wildlife trade now like we do today. And so activities, this human generated activities that are bringing these conditions together that make it so ideal for us to catch a new infectious disease.
How dangerous is the COVID-19?
Well, the current estimate is that the lethality rate, the death rate, is somewhere between 2 to 3%, meaning 2 to 3% of all people who catch the virus will die from it. And it is true that most people who are dying from the virus are people who have underlying conditions, health conditions like diabetes, obesity, and who may be elderly. But it's not always the case. And we are seeing some unusual reactions also happening in young children as well. But it's a pretty it's so in comparison, the annual flu, the flu that we get each season that is miserable for most of us, but for most of us it's not really a major health concern. That death rate is far less than 1%. So the COVID-19 has a much higher lethality rate in comparison to the flu that we get each year.
Okay. Now, so this disease came up through wet market. Is it possible that diseases can spring up through industrial animal farming?
It's absolutely possible, and we've seen that happen many times actually in the past. And three-fourths of emerging infectious diseases, and when we say emerging, we're talking about mostly new infectious diseases that we humans have not really encountered before. Three-fourths of them are coming from other animals. They're called zoonotic diseases. But it's not really the animal's fault. It's the reason why we're seeing an increase in the number of emerging infectious diseases really comes down to how we relate with other animals. And there are several factors that are leading to the increase in these diseases. And one is that, of course, human population is higher than it's ever been ever in history. And there are just way too many people on this planet right now. And so that makes it also easier for us to transmit a virus amongst each other. The second is that we are traveling around the globe far more than we ever have before. And we have seen how quickly that can transmit a virus like it has with COVID. The third factor for the increase in infectious diseases is climate change. Climate change can actually have an impact in especially mosquito-borne viruses, so like the Zika virus. What happens is when we clear natural forests, when we clear the land, we're actually making it better breeding grounds for mosquitoes, and warming temperatures make better breeding, make it easier for mosquitoes to breed. And so we will be continuing to see an increase in these mosquito-borne viruses. So those are three factors, but fourth and fifth are really the wildlife trade and industrial animal farming. And by the wildlife trade, I'm talking about all trade in animals throughout the globe, not just the illegal part, but the legal part too. When we capture animals from the wild or we breed them in captivity, they are shipped around the globe for use to stock zoos, to stock circuses, to be experimental subjects in laboratories. They are shipped around as exotic pets. We're talking about even your birds and your reptiles as pets that are sold in pet stores. And they're shipped around for meat and for fur and leather, and in some forms for traditional medicine in some parts of the world. That wildlife trade, as I mentioned about the wet market, brings a lot of different species together, a lot of sick animals together, miserable animals together. These are animals who may not normally be in contact with each other, species that normally in their natural habitats are not necessarily in contact with each other. But through the wildlife trade, they are brought together And so we can see infectious disease pop up in a species that may never have had that before. And then because humans are interacting with these animals in the wildlife trade, whether it's at the end point, like at a wet market, or at other points of the wildlife trade, then that makes it easier for the infectious disease then to jump into the human species as well. And then the last big culprit in infectious disease emergence is industrial animal farming or factory farming. And the reason why that is such a major concern is because we are talking about, in factory farming, we're talking about at any given time, there are 10 billion animals for every one, no, 10 animals for every one human on this planet. So 10 times the number of animals that are raised, bred, and killed for food per every human. And that is a massive, massive industry. And 95% of these animals are kept in factory farms. So 95%, the majority, far overwhelming majority of the meat, the eggs, and the dairy that people are buying throughout the world are from animals that were kept in factory farms. And in factory farms, you will have animals confined into incredibly small spaces. You may have animals by the hundreds, sometimes the thousands, sometimes the hundreds of thousands confined into a single barn, into a single shed. And so these are animals kept in miserable conditions. They are suffering incredibly. I visited some of these farms. These animals will have open sores just from the miserable treatment. Um, just a lot of different wounds that you can see, visible wounds on these animals. And so you can imagine this is their daily life. And of course, their immune systems are down because they are so distressed. And because they're also so confined, you've got a double whammy in a sense. You've got animals, sick animals, immunocompromised animals, confined in really close quarters. So it's so easy for a virus to spread from animal to animal, like wildfire. And over the past few decades, we've seen new infectious diseases emerging from factory farms. The one that we have been most concerned about is an influenza virus. And usually when we think about influenza viruses, people think, oh, it's just a flu virus. It's no big deal. I can get the vaccine each year, and we deal with it each year. But that's not really what we're talking about when we're talking about the influenza viruses that can come out from factory farming. With factory farming, what we're really talking about is influenza A virus, which is unlike other types of influenza viruses. Influenza A can be carried by a wide variety of animals in addition to humans. So that makes it a very difficult virus to track and to contain. And because it can be carried by birds, by chickens, by turkeys, by pigs, and by humans, in factory farms, these viruses can get together and swap genetic material so that they are not only cause outbreaks among pigs and chickens, but can potentially cause epidemics among humans. And we've seen this happen several times over the past several decades. And what we have been seeing even more is that we've seen a rapid mutation rate in the influenza virus coming out from factory farms.
Now, these diseases that come from animals, when the animals have them, I heard that they're not usually sick themselves. Is that true?
Yeah, it depends. A lot of times the animals can carry the illness and they can be what's called asymptomatic carriers, meaning they're not showing symptoms. So that makes it really difficult, right? It makes it really, unless you're doing routine testing, which no one's doing in factory farms because it's just not cost effective, and there's really no way to do that because we'd have to know exactly what viral strain we're testing for each time. But because a lot of animals can be carriers of the virus and not show symptoms, it makes it very difficult to track. And it makes we've seen this make it easier for us to ship these infected animals throughout the globe. I mean, the meat industry, the dairy, the egg industry, it's a global market. Nothing is confined to one nation. the United States is one of the biggest exporters and importers of animals for meat, eggs, and dairy. Same with Canada, same with China. So it's a very complicated process. So it's, long gone are the days of the family farms where the animals were confined to one place. That doesn't happen anymore.
You compared, I think in your TED talk, you said you compared, you were talking about like mother of all pandemics was the 1988 pandemic.
Yeah, you're talking about the 1918 pandemic. It's
Yeah,
often called the Spanish influenza, and not because it necessarily started out from Spain. I think that's when it was really noticed. But that was it still is the worst pandemic in human history, and it was an influenza virus. It was an H1N1, and it was circulating. Well, there was the virus is as when we saw it emerge in humans, we also saw respiratory illness spreading throughout pig populations as well. And so it's hard to know if the virus came directly from pigs. That virus may have started out from pig farms, or we might have gotten it from pigs, or we might have given it to pigs, because we do know that pigs throughout the world carry descendants of that virus. So the virus is there in pig populations, it's mutating, it's always mutating. But the 1918 virus it's so deadly. It killed about 50 million people worldwide. The estimate is infected about 1/3 of the global population. And it had a lethality rate that's about what we're seeing with COVID, about 2 to 3%, meaning 2 to 3% of the people who got the influenza virus, that 1918 H1N1, died from it. But there were many factors that made it even deadlier at that time. And one was, of course, this was during the time of World War I, so there was a lot of crowding of soldiers that expedited the spread of the virus. And a lot of people were malnourished as well during that time, and healthcare was harder to come by, and people were living in more unsanitary conditions. So those factors led to the higher death rate that we see with the 1918 virus compared to what we're seeing now. But that virus started off as a mild virus. It was a mild influenza virus. It started in the spring of 1918. And then at some point it mutated. And in the fall of 1918, that's when we saw this new strain of the virus. And it was a strain that humans have not seen before. So we had no innate immunity built up. We were not exposed to that virus. So it was completely new. It's completely new to our immune systems. And within a very short period of time, within like 3 to 4 months, that virus just spread so rapidly and killed so many people. And it killed quickly, far quicker than even the COVID viruses today. So if you were to catch that virus in the morning, you might be dead by night. So it was a very, very lethal virus. And as I mentioned, strains of that virus are still circulating among pig populations throughout the world.
So COVID-19 is still not as bad as that 1918 virus?
I would say that the conditions today are not as bad as they were back in 1918. So, we have better medical care, better public health care. We in many parts of the world, better than we have here in the US, but in many parts of the world, people have enacted social distancing and far earlier to help decrease the spread, the transmission of the virus. That was harder to implement back in 1918. We didn't have the kind of communication channels that we have today. We didn't have the surveillance methods that we have today. And of course, again, that was also during a wartime. So you couldn't socially distance soldiers in the trenches during that time. So there were a lot of conditions that made that virus worse. There was also another thing that we saw with the virus is that, unlike COVID-19, at least so far, that 1918 virus tend to go after the younger people. It was it wasn't the elderly people who succumbed most to the virus. It was children and young adults who succumbed most to the virus. And the reason why is that the virus likely caused what's called a cytokine storm, meaning it, in healthy young people, the virus not only boosted their immune, stimulated their immune system, but caused an overreaction of people's immune system. And in many cases, we see that it's our own immune systems that turn against us. It's not necessarily the virus that kills us or causes the health conditions that we face, but it's what our bodies, how our bodies react to those viruses. So our own immune system can hyperreact and cause multi-organ damage, cause encephalitis, brain swelling, and many other things that can lead to a far higher death rate than what would be caused by the virus itself.
And how many about what percent of infectious diseases come from animals, and why?
Yeah, so about 2/3 of infectious diseases, the new infectious diseases, are coming from other animals. And you think about, there's so many viruses circulating throughout the globe, and we know of only piddly, a small percentage of these viruses. So there's so much that is unknown, and so many viruses that are carried by so many different species. Just as we give viruses to other animals, we can get viruses from other animals. So when people think of zoonotic diseases, it's important to note that it goes both ways. That basically means diseases that can pass from one animal to human or from human to an animal. For example, we've given tuberculosis to elephants. We might have given us an influenza virus to pigs. Another thing is that we have seen different strains of coronavirus circulating among pigs and among birds in factory farms as well. Now, whether or not the COVID-19 virus is circulating among pigs, whether or not these animals in factory farms, the chickens, the turkeys, and pigs, and so on, whether they can get this COVID-19, that remains to be seen. And I don't know of any investigation, really, which is rather concerning, because if the virus is contracted by these animals in factory farms, then it's going to be even harder to contain, and we have an even higher likelihood of the virus mutating to a potentially deadlier form, one that we may not have a vaccine for. So right now, the vaccine development is for the current COVID-19 strain. But if it mutates, the virus any vaccines that's being created now may not work. And with viruses, they're always mutating. And so we're always playing catch up. And that's what's so scary and so concerning about viruses.
Yeah, I heard that in 20 years, our antibiotics would be useless. Do you have any insight on that?
Yeah, so we're unfortunately, it's like I hate to be, I feel like I'm sitting here giving everyone bad news.
Well, we'll get to the good news in a little bit.
Yeah. But we have overused antibiotics, and we're facing the end of the antibiotic era. And this has been coming out of public health agencies for the past decade or two, actually, and it's been predicted that this is happening. And I will say that, again, factory farming is a huge culprit in this. 70% of the antibiotics used globally are being pumped into animals in factory farms. And most of these antibiotics are human relevant antibiotics, meaning that they have significance for human health as well. So when we're pumping them into factory farms, the reason why they're being given to animals into factory farms is the conditions are so bad that the factory farmers are doing whatever they can to keep these animals surviving just long enough until they slaughter them. And because these conditions are so bad, it's so easy for these animals to get so many diseases that they are being constantly pumped with low doses of antibiotics. just to get them to survive long enough. That's how bad the conditions are. And so you can't have factory farming without these antibiotics. You can't have those kinds of conditions and keep those animals even surviving for the several months that they are allowed to live without these antibiotics being pumped into them. And so we are seeing a high rise in antibiotic resistance. Now, that factory farming isn't the only reason for the antibiotic resistance, but it is probably the main reason for this increasing in antibiotic resistance. And so that's, in a sense, that's kind of, that compounds the problem that we're facing with these new viruses that are emerging. And so think about it. So antibiotics don't combat viruses. They're not for treatment of viruses. We have nothing like that for viruses. But antibiotics are for bacteria. And one of the problems with viruses, though, is, and one of the ways that viruses can kill is not by what they do directly to the body, but what happens afterwards. So if you get hit with the COVID-19, for example, your immune system may be so stressed trying to combat this COVID-19 that you are very susceptible to a secondary infection from a bacteria. And this is what we see with patients with HIV. Their immune systems are so compromised that it makes it so easy for them to get bacterial infections, and they often die and get very ill from these bacterial infections. And so this is what we see with pandemic-like viruses, including the 1918 virus. So if we don't have good antibiotics to treat the secondary bacterial infections that can follow a virus, then we have increased our risk for death as well. So I wish I could say that we had good news about this, but we are just on the brink of seeing more pandemics rise unless we change how we treat animals, unless we drastically reduce our human population, unless we drastically reduce the wildlife trade, drastically reduce factory farming. And that means all of us cutting back on eating animals. And I would argue, don't eat animals at all. You're going to be far better not doing it. You'll be far healthier. And unless we change our disruption, unless we curtail our disruption of natural ecosystems, unless we do all those things, we are going to see more infectious diseases coming at a faster and faster rate.
Kind of, can you see what kind of diseases might be coming?
Yeah, I have to tell you, I underestimated the impact of this coronavirus when it hit, when we first learned about it back in the winter. I thought it was going to follow the pattern of the SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome virus, the coronavirus that caused SARS back in 2003. And that's a coronavirus as well. And SARS emerged likely from these live markets in China, passed on again. The primary host may have been fruit bats, and then the virus jumped to another species and then ultimately to humans. At the time in 2003, though, the SARS virus stayed in Southeast Asia predominantly. It did spread throughout the region, but it didn't spread further than that. And I expected this coronavirus to do the same, not to spread globally like it did. But I really underestimated what a difference, how much we travel now compared to how much we traveled back in 2003. And so because of how much we travel all the time now, and so this virus just was able to spread so quickly. So that's a lesson for us. There's no such thing as a virus not anymore. There's no such thing as an infectious disease that will only happen over there. Anything that happens anywhere, any infectious disease that happens anywhere has global implications. It can happen everywhere.
Yeah. Hate to have you still be the voice of doom, but
Yeah.
Yeah. Now you mentioned earlier about cutting down the forests. You said that it releases the mosquitoes. Wasn't there other reasons that cutting down forests is harm? It would like cause viruses?
For forests, there's a lot of implications there, but we've seen that fragmentation of the forest is likely the culprit behind the rise in Lyme diseases, or Lyme disease, and that's because it allows for certain types of animals to survive better than other animals, and it allowed for small-footed mice, for example, to survive better in these fragmented forests, and it's easy, and they're more likely to carry the ticks that carry Lyme disease. So the fragmentation of the forest, uh, uh, breaking down of the cutting down of the forest can cause a rise in infectious diseases in many ways. The two main ways that we will see it is through the destruction of our forests, and that includes the Amazon, is that also increases global warming, that increases global climate change. And again, that goes back then to it makes it easier for mosquitoes to breed with global warming. And I will go back, and I don't mean to harp on this, but even with climate change and the destruction of the forests, we're going back to industrial animal agriculture as the main culprit. It is the main culprit. It is the number one reason why the Amazon is being cut down today. It's the main human use of land. And when I say factory farming, I'm not just talking about the confinement of animals themselves, but that also includes the feed crops that are raised, that are given to these animals. So most of the crops that are grown on this planet are not given to humans directly. Most of the crops are fed to these animals in factory farms, which then we eat. And that's actually an incredibly inefficient process, because for example, out of about 10 pounds of plant protein, you get 1 pound of meat protein. So that's 10 pounds of plant protein that could have been fed directly to humans who are starving. It would have reduced our reliance on the land, reduced our use of water, reduced our use of chemicals and pesticides. And so there's a lot of different reasons to really take a look at what we eat, and I would say who we eat, and think about cutting back on the use of animals on our plate, on starting to think about different ways of nourishing ourselves that are healthier for us as well.
Isn't also like cutting down forests that the animals run to the city and spread diseases there?
Yeah. So when we cut down the forest, and we're talking about disruption of ecosystems and encroachment on animals' natural habitat. So, for example, in many parts of Africa, the logging industry has been caused a big boon in Ebola outbreaks, and who knows, it might have been partly to blame for how we got HIV. We get Ebola and HIV originally from non-human primates, including chimpanzees, and if the more the more humans stay separate from these animal populations, the less likely, of course, we're going to get those diseases. But in part because of the logging industry, in part of cutting down these forests, that's brought animals and humans closer and closer together, animal populations and human populations closer together. So that makes it very easy for an infectious disease to spill over into the human population. And this is why we've been seeing outbreaks happening pretty much on a regular frequency now in many parts of Africa, outbreaks of Ebola, for example.
You mentioned earlier, like, was it two out of is it 2 out of 3 diseases are caused by wet markets and factory farms? Was it 2 out of 3 or?
Yeah, so 2 out of 3, about 2/3 of infectious diseases are coming from other animals. So meaning that these are new infectious diseases that we're seeing for the first time, that we're getting from other animals. And that includes the current COVID-19. It includes the swine flus. I don't know if you guys remember H1N1 back in 2009. That was the swine flu. That ended up being very infectious, but we were lucky at the time. It ended up not being so deadly. But that's still circulating among pigs and chickens and farms. So that includes swine flu, that includes different forms of avian influenza. In 1997, there was an outbreak of an avian influenza H5N1 that in China, and that had a death rate of 60%. So think about that. COVID has a death rate of 2 to 3%. That avian influenza had a death rate of 60%. There was a in earlier in 2010s, there's a Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, which was transmitted from camels to humans. There's been the Nipah virus that came from fruit bats and transmitted onto pigs to humans in Malaysia. And those are just some examples of the infectious diseases that we've been seeing coming from other animals. And HIV, of course, is one of them. But these infectious diseases are just going to increase unless we seriously curtail, unless we really take a hard look at our activities and how we use our natural environment, how we treat other animals, and how we travel around the globe, and how we overpopulate on this planet. Unless we really take a hard look at all these issues, we're unfortunately going to see more and more infectious diseases, and we will likely see a pandemic that will come about that's far worse than what we're facing today. So I mentioned the avian influenza, the H5N1, 60% death rate. And that's about what we're seeing with the MERS, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, that had actually about a 70% death rate. Those viruses, fortunately, so far, as deadly as they were, have not been easily transmittable among humans. So they weren't very infectious among humans. But they're out there. Those viruses are still out there. They're still circulating. Viruses are constantly mutating. We don't know what they're doing. We can't keep track of every single animal and what every animal is carrying and what viruses is doing in every single animal out there. So these viruses are constantly mutating, and so we are always going to be at risk of these viruses.
We should just leave animals alone.
That's exactly, I'm sure that would be what they would say, that's for sure. And it's better for us too. And I'm hoping that if there's one silver lining out of this, and I say silver lining in the softest way possible, but maybe this will really get more and more people to take a good look at how we have been with our environment, with our planet, and with other animals, and then to start thinking about how we want to be moving forward. And we're also learning other things with this virus, right? We're learning about how we want to treat each other. So I think this is a time for all of us to pause and reflect on many of the assumptions we've made, many of our habits, many of the ways that we thought were okay, the behaviors that we thought were okay to have, and now to rethink those behaviors and think more globally and think about the future in a more wise way, and hopefully compassionate way as well.
Now, so there are zoonotic diseases that exist not due to us, not due to factory farms or wet markets, or
Yeah, zoonotic diseases really just mean they're infectious diseases being carried by every species, including humans, and we're the biggest threat to each other in many ways. But every species carries infectious diseases, and whether or not we're going to catch an infectious disease from another animal really hinges on how we interact with that other animal. So there are a lot of diseases out there that we don't even know about, a lot of viruses that we don't know about yet that are being carried by other animals. And if we don't change our behaviors, if we don't change how we think, how we relate with other animals, we are probably going to know about those viruses very soon.
could one of Could there be a virus coming up that's going to be like super bad?
Yeah, and we saw that with the MERS, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. We saw that with H5N1, death rate of lethality rate of 60 to 70%. And those viruses, if they just need to mutate a few things, so that our immune systems, they just need to mutate in certain ways, so that they can attach to certain receptors in the cells in our nasal passages and our respiratory systems in our upper respiratory tract, that then makes it easier for us to transmit the virus to each other. So yeah, we are certainly not free from these viruses, and we will likely see a worse one come about.
So yeah, so something could come up that'll make the COVID-19 look like a sniffle.
Yeah, exactly. As bad as this virus is, as horrible as it's been for so many people, we could be facing a far worse one.
Um, Now, okay, so say another, so what could somebody do to protect, well, themselves, to like from an upcoming, set or this one, or an upcoming virus?
So on an individual level, you know, the healthier you are in general, I'm saying this in general, the healthier you are, the more likely you will be able to fight off a new virus and any infectious disease. That's not always the case, unfortunately, as we saw with the 1918 virus that tended to go after the healthier people because it hyperstimulated their healthy immune systems, which turned on their own bodies. But in general, the healthier you are, the better off you're going to be, the better able you will be to fight off any new infectious disease. And that means cutting down on your risk for these other chronic conditions that is what's taking down so many people right now with COVID, and that means diabetes and heart disease and obesity and many of these other types of conditions that make it harder for our bodies. Our bodies with those conditions are already strained enough, and we have a hard time fighting off a new insult, meaning a new infectious disease. And one one of the best ways to reduce your risk of all of those conditions and diseases I mentioned is to move more into a plant-based diet. And it's so much healthier. As a neurologist, I can tell you I've been seeing people in their 30s getting strokes, in their 30s, you know, and there's no reason why people in their 30s should be getting strokes. There's no reason why we should be getting strokes and heart disease and diabetes and having obesity and all these conditions in our 30s and our 40s and even our 50s and 60s. We know that a predominantly plant-based diet is the healthiest diet for all of us. We know that. You will get all the nutrients you need, and you will significantly lower your risk for all of those conditions and diseases, as well as many forms of cancer. So that's one thing you can do as an individual to protect yourself in the future. Then, of course, there are other things that you can do to protect yourself now, and that includes um, following public health advice. You know, if the advice is that we are not ready yet to congregate, then don't congregate. Wear a mask, wear a face mask, keep yourself distant from people. We know that a 6 feet distance tends to be a good marker. It's harder for the virus to be transmitted beyond 6 feet. We're less likely to sneeze the virus onto someone beyond 6 feet, for example. So you know, follow the public health advice. Don't follow political advice. Follow public health advice. Sound public health advice.
I know that people on a plant-based diet can get the virus. Have you heard of anybody on a plant-based diet dying from it?
Oh, I personally don't know of any, but it doesn't mean that there hasn't been any deaths from people who've been on plant-based diets or vegan diets. So when I say that it's healthy in general, I just want to make it clear. It doesn't mean that you are safe from the virus.
Right, yeah.
This is just general sound advice, right, for all of us. But yes, there are many factors involved. Healthcare workers, maybe even if you are the fittest, the healthiest healthcare worker on a pure plant-based diet, but if you are seeing COVID infected patients on a daily basis, you are being exposed to the virus at sometimes incredibly high doses of the virus. And so that makes you more susceptible to catching it. There's so many factors involved. But so I don't think there's been, no one's been able to do any kind of study really to look at whether plant-based diets themselves, how many people in a plant on a plant-based diet have been catching the infection versus how many people not. We public health agencies are scrambling just to take care of the problem. So there's been no resources to really go into that kind of study, not at this time.
Let me see if I can open it up. Anybody else have a question? Um,
I'm just wondering where we go from here in terms of, I mean, obviously it takes education. Everyone needs to understand how their eating and living impacts the world. And I guess beyond that, what do you see as our next step in hopefully solving this problem? I realize there are a lot of elements to it, but
Yeah, it's to really tackle this problem. We really need our political leaders and our public health leaders to really get in on the action in a sense, right? They need to start taking these issues seriously, and they're not. They haven't been really addressing these underlying causes. I mean, we know there's been hardly any mention of the underlying causes of these infectious diseases, even in our mainstream media. I've seen maybe one or two articles in the New York Times, one or two in the Washington Post. You compare that with the number of articles addressing every other aspect of the coronavirus, and we should be, so they are not helping, and they're actually hurting in many regards. So we need people to write letters to the editor to tell them that they need to start paying attention and really doing their research and their work and exploring why are we getting these infectious diseases, where are they coming from. So there needs to be more on the part of our media to get that information out there, and our public health agencies have really dropped the ball as well. In that respect, in the sense that they're not really going into depth into and really educating people why we are seeing these new infectious diseases, where they're coming from, and how we can prevent them. And I worked at the Food and Drug Administration for a decade, and that was one of the things that I was very frustrated about, because we would always talk about what vaccines and what drugs can we get when these pandemics hit, but we never talked about how to prevent a pandemic in the first place. What do we need to do, and how do we educate people, and how do we how do we educate our political leaders on the dangers of industrial farming, and the dangers of the wildlife trade, and the dangers of our disruption of natural ecosystems and the habitats and so on. And so that's been a real failing. But one thing I do say, we don't have to wait for our political leaders to do the right thing, because otherwise we'll be waiting for a long, long time. But we can at least start making steps on an individual basis. And one of the most significant things each of us can do is really change what we eat, change our plate of food. And it seems so simple. For some people, it might seem complicated, but it really is a simple thing. There's so many products out there. There's so many options out there, so many healthy options that are also incredibly tasty. So we're not suffering for it. you know, I love to eat. I love food. I love to eat, and I never feel that I'm depriving myself by being a vegan or being on a plant-based diet. And no one will be if you look at all options out there. So I'd really say start, if you want to start slow, start with maybe one meal a day, or start with one day a week, change what you eat, and go from there.
And for those of us who are kind of already on the vegan road, what are other ways that we could possibly help to change the cycle, I guess, in the world around us?
Yeah. Exert pressure on our political leaders and write those letters to the editor, write to our Congress, let them know that we need them to step up and start really addressing these underlying causes, and not to subsidize factory farms, for example, but instead put our tax dollars into subsidizing production of produce that we can eat directly, that's healthier for us and better for the animals and better for the environment. You know, as much as you can, educate your family and friends and let them know about videos like this. I'm not the only person talking about these things, and there are other videos out there, other articles out there about the causes of these pandemics, and share that information. What we have learned from studies is that it takes, on average, a person to hear something 7 times before it really sinks in. So don't think sharing an article one time will be enough. Keep doing it. Keep doing it. It's going to take a while.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Akhtar, you written a couple books. You want to tell the us about them? And
Sure, yeah. So the first book I wrote was an academic book. It was Animals in Public Health, and it looked at the many ways in which our relationships with animals, how it impacts our health as individuals and on a public health factor. So that looked at that looked at many of the issues that we're talking about now, the rise of infectious diseases, where they're coming from. It looked at industrial animal farming. It looked at the link between violence towards animals and violence towards humans, especially with domestic violence. And it explored the use of animals in experimentation, and how it's actually it has been really holding us back, because we're learning more and more that the use of other species to try to mimic human biology isn't really working. It might have worked a long time ago in the past when we're looking at gross anatomy and gross physiology, but we're far beyond that now. So it explores those issues. And then my most recent book that came out last year is Our Symphony with Animals. It's on health, empathy, and our shared destinies. And that explores some of the same issues as the first book, but this is more geared towards the general audience, and it's more through storytelling. And I travel around the country and get stories of many people whose lives have been impacted by their relationships with animals. And that includes people who've been positively impacted by their relationships with animals. That includes looking at the domestic violence link, and how many survivors of domestic violence have found courage and strength through their relationships with animals. We know people with post-traumatic stress disorder in the military who've been helped through their relationships with animals. And the book also explores the other side. So the link between violence towards animals and violence towards humans. I interview a serial killer who was cruel to countless animals, and of course killed 8 women in an incredibly cruel way, and he's someone who recognized that link. So it explores a wide range of stories of how our relationships with animals can impact our well-being.
Now, regrettably, our library doesn't carry Our Symphony with Animals. That's something I'm going to rectify once I get back. But it is also available on Hoopla, and other libraries do have it. So once we do open, we'll be able to get them. If anybody is interested in the book, how could they obtain a copy?
Well, I hate to say this because I'm not a huge fan, but it's out there on Amazon. But you can also get it through Barnes and Nobles, online, Target online, and it's if you just Google my name, Aysha Akhtar. I have a website as well, and I have different links to different venues where you can purchase the book if you'd like.
Okay. Does anyone else have any other questions? Okay, well, I guess that we've got a good hour in. I'm sorry we couldn't get more people. So I guess to wrap it up, you can stay connected with the Dearborn Heights libraries by visiting our website on the World Wide Web at dhcl.mishlibrary.org, or visit us on Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, Instagram, and YouTube. On YouTube, you will find this presentation as well as others and many other programs geared to all ages. By visiting these sites, you will also be able to find out how to log into upcoming programs, as well as find out about other upcoming events. Also, our digital library is also open when you can log into Hoopla, Overdrive, Tumble Books, Mango, Ancestry.com, and other electronic databases. This has been a production of the Dearborn Heights Library, a department of the City of Dearborn Heights, Michigan. Thank you for watching.
Thank you, Doctor. Great talk.
Thank you very much for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye.